It began with the sound of wind brushing through cotton dresses, light footsteps on gravel, the clink of tin trays being carried carefully in both hands. August 1944, mid-morning. The sun hung over Camp Ashford, Utah, a POW facility surrounded by wire and silence. Inside Compound C, 162 German prisoners stood in formation, not for inspection, not for punishment, for something else, something none of them expected. For the last 6 weeks, they'd lived in tension, not from beatings or starvation, but from the unfamiliar. The American guards were polite. The food came regularly. Nobody had kicked in teeth or fired shots above their heads. They had been treated not like enemies, but like men. And now came something worse than cruelty. Kindness. They weren't ready. Feldwebel Jakob Weber hadn't said a word since breakfast. He stood rigid, sweat beading under his collar, eyes locked ahead at the compound gate. The last time women had walked toward him, it had been in a different war zone entirely, nurses rushing bloodied men into aid stations in Normandy. But these women didn't carry stretchers. They carried pie. Lemon, cherry, peach slices on plates, warm from the kitchen, steam rising in the desert sun. The American nurses stepped forward, all 5 of them, in pressed white uniforms with red crosses stitched on the shoulders. They moved with the efficiency of a field hospital and the grace of Sunday school teachers. One nurse, no older than 22, smiled gently as she handed the first slice to a wiry, scar-faced prisoner with trembling hands. He stared at it. He didn't move. Then, without warning, he wept. Not loud, not ugly. Just a sound from deep inside, as if something too rusted to move had finally broken loose. The slice of pie shook in his fingers, untouched. Others followed, one by one, silent, stunned, unraveling. Corporal Dieter Kunz dropped to a squat, elbows on knees, pie untouched in the dirt. Lieutenant Franz Mayer took his plate with mechanical precision, blinked twice, and handed it back with a polite, dank Schwester, before walking in a daze to the corner of the yard. Weber didn't cry, not at first. He stood still, watching, chest tight. He'd buried his comrades under collapsed bunkers, had held men down while they bled out in Normandy, whispering prayers to gods neither of them believed in anymore. But now, under a blue sky, behind barbed wire that didn't feel like a prison, he watched as American women handed out kindness with silverware and smiled, not to mock, not to shame, but to care. It was too much. The guards didn't interrupt. They stood aside, unsure of the protocol for mercy. Captain Robert Hayes, the American officer in charge of the compound, stood on the catwalk overlooking the yard, his face unreadable. He had ordered this, the nurses, the pie, the music now trickling through the loudspeakers, Glenn Miller's orchestra humming through an old camp radio. A week ago, he'd sat with the Red Cross representative who toured the camp. She'd said something that stuck. If they go home knowing we treated them like humans, that will shake more than their weapons ever did. Hayes wasn't sentimental, but he understood logistics. Psychological warfare didn't always require bullets. Sometimes it needed nurses. The pie came with notes, handwritten, small folded cards slipped discreetly onto trays or into pockets. Some were simple, peace will come. Others more pointed, you are not your orders. One read, my brother was at Bastogne, I still want you to go home. Nobody dared read them aloud. Some were torn up, others were hidden. But they were all read. That night in Barrack 3, Jakob Weber sat on the edge of his bunk, the card in his lap. He hadn't cried earlier, not when the pie was handed to him, not when he watched Sergeant Baumann curl into a ball on the gravel and sob for 15 minutes. But now, under the weak yellow bulb, he stared at the card again. You are not your orders. He had killed. He had followed orders in towns with names he couldn't pronounce, had kicked in doors, had dragged men from cellars, had stared down at trembling women and done nothing. He had followed. He folded the card, then unfolded it, then folded it again. And finally he cried. Across the yard, Nurse Abigail Monroe washed her hands in the field sink, watching the lights flicker out across the compound. She didn't know if it had worked. She hadn't come for glory. Her brother had died in Salerno, and she'd volunteered for the Corps 3 weeks later. She didn't hate the men behind the wire. She didn't trust them either. But she believed something deeper than either. That if war made monsters, maybe kindness could make men again. The next morning she returned. The second morning began without ceremony. No music over the loudspeakers. No pie. No notes. Just a line of German POWs shuffling across the dusty yard toward the infirmary queue. The sun beat down from a cloudless Utah sky, drawing sweat from cotton uniforms and the rusted wire fences that framed their world. Feldwebel Jakob Weber stood at the end of the line, arms crossed behind his back, the soft throb in his left knee growing louder with every step. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the pie. Not a word. Not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing he'd say could touch the thing that had stirred inside him yesterday, and because everyone else was quiet too. The men were different. That was obvious. Not broken, not turned, but slower, as if something inside them had shifted a degree. No one snapped about the coffee being lukewarm. No one shoved past the older prisoners at the water pump. Even Corporal Kunz, who'd once punched a man over a missing sock, now sat alone near the fence, staring out at the horizon as if expecting the Alps to materialize from the heat waves. Inside the infirmary tent, the air smelled of iodine and floor polish. A canvas flap opened, and Nurse Abigail Monroe leaned out, clipboard in hand, calling the next man. Jakob limped forward. She looked up, Feldwebel Weber. He nodded. She offered a small smile and held the flap open. Please. He ducked inside, blinking against the cooler shade. The space was clean, sparse, 2 folding cots, a row of tin trays stacked with gauze and forceps, a small phonograph in the corner, silent for now. A fan clacked quietly, doing its best to stir the heavy air. Sit here, please, she gestured to the cot. Left leg. He hesitated, then sat. Yes, shrapnel, June. Shrapnel where? Caen, Normandy. Abigail paused. D-Day. Jakob nodded. She knelt by the cot, her fingers already tugging at the laces of his boot. He flinched. I need to see the knee, she said gently. I won't bite. He exhaled and looked away. The boot came off, then the sock, then the scar, a jagged white gash bisecting his kneecap like lightning frozen in flesh. She touched it, not roughly, not gently, just professionally. He looked down at her, this woman kneeling before him in white, with the enemy's insignia on her shoulder, and suddenly felt sick. Why do you do this? He asked. She didn't look up. Because you're injured. I'm the enemy. Not today. You're helping me walk again. You already can walk. Then why are you helping me walk without pain? Abigail stood. Because pain makes people cruel, and we've had enough cruelty. Jakob stared at her, then turned away. I killed Americans, he said finally. I know. I shot a medic once. He had a red cross on his sleeve. I know, she repeated, softer now. There was silence, just the ticking of the fan, the groan of the cot frame beneath his weight. I didn't feel anything then, he muttered. Not even later, not shame, not pride, nothing. She began rapping his knee. Do you feel something now? Jakob didn't answer. He just closed his eyes. That night he dreamed of the medic, and this time the Red Cross bled. The next morning, more men showed up at the infirmary. Not for injuries. For conversation. Private Koch asked Abigail about her hometown. Sergeant Bauman wanted to know the English word for piano. Lieutenant Mayer asked for aspirin, and then apologized for speaking too loudly. By the fifth day, it became routine. The prisoners lined up even if they didn't need medical care. Some invented aches. Some just wanted to sit for 5 minutes where the smell of disinfectant felt strangely safe. The other nurses began to notice it too. He asked if I believed in God, one said to Abigail in the break tent. What did you tell him? She asked. I told him I wasn't sure anymore. Did he say anything back? Just nodded. Did he cry? No, but I think he wanted to. In the following weeks, something unthinkable happened. The German POWs stopped saluting each other. Not entirely, they still nodded, still gave each other formal courtesies, but the rigidness faded. The clicks of heels were softer, the ranks blurred. They laughed sometimes, quietly like it was a crime. But they laughed. And the nurses who had come here to patch bullet wounds, to check teeth, to hand out quinine found themselves becoming something else. Confessors, mirrors, wounds of a different kind rose to the surface, memories, regrets, unanswered questions, guilt. One prisoner carved birds out of soap. Another drew portraits of the guards and nurses on salvaged cardboard with crushed coal. They gave these drawings away like peace offerings. On Sunday afternoons, some men stood near the fence when the chapel bell rang. They didn't enter, but they listened. Abigail wrote letters to her mother back home in Kansas. Ma, you won't believe what I'm seeing. These boys, yes, boys, they're not what the papers say. Some are cruel, yes. Some are monsters, I'm sure, but some just look like my brother did after his first deployment. Thin, lost, tired of war. They ask me strange questions like, is Ohio near Chicago, or do American women hate us? One gave me a wooden ring, carved it from a fence post scrap, said he was a jeweler before the war, didn't ask for anything in return. I think some of them are afraid of peace. In Barrack 3, Jakob Weber kept a notebook now, small, cloth-bound, hidden under his cot mattress. He didn't write much, just words that stuck in his head. Cigarettes and kindness. The sky over Utah looks like Bavaria. The nurse didn't flinch when I said I was from SS Panzer. I was 16 when the first propaganda film showed a laughing American girl and said she'd spit on my grave. She gave me pie. He didn't know why he wrote it down, he just did. Some nights he read the entries to himself, as if trying to verify his own memories, as if afraid the world outside the wire would call it all a lie. One day, during laundry duty, he heard music drifting from the infirmary again, Glenn Miller, soft and scratchy from a dusty phonograph. Without thinking, he followed the sound. And when he stepped into the open infirmary door and saw Nurse Monroe humming while folding bandages, he didn't speak. He just stood there. She looked up. Do you need something? I know, I just... Sit, she said. He did. No injury, no lie. Just the weight in his chest. She didn't ask, she didn't push. She just turned the music up slightly and handed him a cup of cold water. He drank it. That was all. Afterward he walked out, past the barbed wire, back to Barrack 3. And he wept. Not because he was weak. Because he wasn't allowed to say thank you. Because the war had taken that from him. And someone, without even knowing it, had just given it back. They came in pairs now, not for medical issues, for conversation. 2 German prisoners at a time were permitted to volunteer for infirmary duty, folding sheets, emptying waste bins, washing surgical trays in the low metal sinks. No guards needed to stand by the door anymore. No one tried to run. Corporal Kunz, the man who once smashed a tin cup over another's head for speaking English too well, now carefully arranged the bandage drawers by length. He folded towels in perfect thirds, murmuring the old marching cadence of the Heer to himself, but not loud enough to bother the nurses. He hadn't looked anyone in the eye for weeks. Not after he confessed, haltingly in English, to Abigail Monroe that he used to be a teacher, a history teacher. He said it while rinsing surgical scissors, eyes fixed on the water. Abigail had looked up from her chart, caught the tremor in his voice, and simply said, "I used to teach too. Sunday school." He didn't reply, but he folded the next towel slower. In Barrack 6, a new arrival stirred old fears. Lieutenant Otto Hartmann had been captured in France barely 3 weeks prior. His face was still swollen from the blast that sent him flying out of an Opel Blitz. He walked with a limp, his eyes hard, his uniform crisp even after transit. Hartmann stood in the mess line on his first morning and saw the camp's state, men smiling, guards chatting with prisoners, American jazz drifting in from the main hall's open window. He watched a corporal hand a drawing of a horse to a nurse and receive a thank you pat on the shoulder. And something inside Hartmann twisted. "You're laughing with them," he hissed later that evening to Jakob Weber. "You beg for aspirin from the enemy's women and call it mercy." Jakob said nothing. He was sitting by the window, carving another chess piece out of a bar of soap, a knight, the 6th in the set. Hartmann moved closer. "These Americans smile because they've crushed you, and you're helping them sleep better at night." Jakob placed the soap knight on the windowsill and met Hartmann's stare. "I don't care how they sleep," he said, "but I sleep now." Hartmann left the barracks without another word. In the nurses' quarters, just beyond the compound fence, Abigail unrolled a letter from her older sister back in Kansas. It was the 3rd time she'd read it that week. "You should be careful. Pa says they're still Germans no matter how kind they look. They don't deserve pie. They deserve to remember what they did. We're proud of you, but we're also scared for you." She folded the letter slowly, slid it beneath her pillow. She didn't disagree, not entirely. The scars weren't gone. Some prisoners still barked at each other in clipped orders when they thought no one was listening. Some refused to make eye contact. Some scribbled in notebooks in the dark corners of the yard, muttering lines of poetry or equations. One had thrown his tray at a nurse during the first week. That man now sat alone most days, whispering apologies into his hands. The nurses kept showing up. Not out of naivety, but out of something else. On the last Sunday of September, a piano arrived. Donated by a local church, delivered by truck and pushed into the multi-purpose hall that doubled as a mess and gathering area. The keys were chipped. The E above middle C didn't play. That night an American corporal played it softly, Moonlight Serenade. While the prisoners sat in rows, chairs scraped across the concrete floor, unsure whether to sit or stand or speak. Nurse Catherine Lowry was the one who broke the silence. She stood beside the piano and sang. Her voice wasn't loud, it wasn't trained, but it was true. The lyrics trembled in the dust motes above the floor, and for the first time since the barbed wire went up, everyone in the camp listened to the same thing at the same time, for the same reason. Some men closed their eyes. Some wept silently. One asked later if the melody was based on a German hymn because it made him feel like home. Jakob Weber sat in the last row. He didn't cry, he didn't sing. But when Nurse Monroe walked past him afterward and said, "You carved that night beautifully," he looked up and smiled. It was small, faint, but it stayed. 2 days later, a delivery came from the Red Cross. Updated uniforms, basic supplies, 2 crates of donated books. One was a German translation of Mice and Men. It circulated through the barracks like contraband, the pages dog-eared and annotated with tiny handwriting in pencil. Some underlined whole paragraphs. Others added questions in the margins. Why does Lenny die? Why does George do it? Is mercy always death? Jakob copied some of those questions into his notebook, then crossed them out, then wrote them again. One night, under lamplight, He handed the notebook to Nurse Monroe as she left the infirmary. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked. "Because I want someone to read it after the war." "You think I'll outlive you?" He shrugged. "You're not in uniform." She opened the cover. Inside, the first page read, "If I am kind now, does it erase what I was?" She closed it carefully, tucked it under her arm, and walked away without speaking. That night she read it cover to cover. And then she cried. Not long after, Hartman confronted Jakob again, not with anger this time, but with something close to confusion. "They're rewriting us," he said, "turning us into something soft." "No," Jakob replied, "they're showing us what we were supposed to be." Hartman didn't respond. But that evening he sat alone near the fence line, and when the music began again from the mess hall, he didn't walk away. In early October, a change in the air came with the frost. The nights grew colder, blankets were distributed, hot cider in the infirmary was offered instead of water, Nurse Monroe wore a thicker coat. The prisoner's breath rose in pale clouds during morning roll call. With winter approaching, the war beyond the fences moved ever closer to its final chapter. But inside Camp Ashford, something strange and quiet had already changed. The guards joked that morale was suspiciously high, and nobody dared complain about the food anymore. One nurse called it reverse occupation. One prisoner, carving his 10th soap sculpture, called it surrender of the soul. Jakob just called it autumn. He watched the leaves change, read Steinbeck in English now, spoke slower, listened more. He hadn't heard gunfire in months. He didn't want to again. Neither did the men around him. They didn't say it, but it was understood. The war was still out there, but in here something else had begun. The letter arrived in late October. Typed, signed in black ink, sealed with an army crest. It came through the guardhouse like any other parcel: coffee, powdered milk, wool socks. But this envelope did not contain relief. It carried a decision. The War Department had approved a new protocol. Starting immediately, prisoners could be selected for early repatriation. Not all, just a few, volunteers, low risk. The camp held its breath. Captain Robert Hayes read the memo twice, then again. He lit a cigarette and sat on the edge of his desk, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. The letter felt like a tremor before the earthquake. One moment the wire fence meant forever. The next, it might mean until Christmas. He called the nurses first. "We're going to need new medical profiles," he told them. "For transfer, it'll be quiet, selective. Don't mention it until we're ready." Nurse Monroe nodded slowly. "How many?" 10, maybe 20. "Will they be the ones who have changed?" Hayes stared at the window. The piano in the rec hall played faintly, barely audible over the wind. "They're the only ones I'll consider." The news broke anyway. A rumor at first, muttered in German near the pump, overheard by a guard, passed between bunks like contraband. Within a day the compound felt different. Men whispered in corners. Letters home were rewritten. The barbed wire began to gleam in a new way, less like a cage, more like a threshold. Some smiled more, others shut down completely. And some became desperate. Otto Hartman was one of them. He knocked on Nurse Monroe's office door the next morning, his cap tucked under his arm, his back stiff with a soldier's spine. "I'm eligible," he said without waiting to be asked. "No violent incidents, good behavior. He swallowed, I've even been helping teach English to the younger ones." Abigail studied him. His eyes were sunken. He looked thinner than before. "And why do you want to go home?" she asked quietly. He blinked. "Because I don't want to die in a place that isn't Germany." She said nothing. "I can work, I know glasswork. My father ran a workshop in Dresden. I'm not a threat, I swear it." Abigail reached for the clipboard. "We'll include your name." He exhaled, shoulders slumping. "Thank you." She paused. "Is it true you hit a French boy during transport in 43? His head snapped up. "I what?" "Before you arrived. One of the nurses heard it from a driver." Hartman's mouth opened, then closed. "I don't remember." Abigail made a mark on the form. Memory's a tricky thing. He didn't argue, just backed out of the room and disappeared into the wind. Jakob Weber wasn't surprised when his name appeared on the preliminary list. He found out through Kunz, who held the notice like a live wire. "You're going back," Kunz whispered. "They picked you." Jakob looked at the paper for a long time, then nodded, slowly. But something in his gut twisted. He didn't feel relief. He felt loss. That night the air inside Barrack 3 was heavy. The stove ticked in the corner, casting orange shadows across the floor. The chessboard Jakob had carved sat untouched on the table, mid-game. "I don't think I want to go," Jakob said at last. Nobody answered at first. Then Kunz chuckled, not cruelly, just tired. "Are you mad?" "I'm serious." "You want to stay in a prison camp?" "I want to stay where I don't feel like a weapon." Kunz stood, walked to the window, lit a cigarette and exhaled hard. "Do you think they'll let us go back and just start over?" Jakob said nothing. "They'll need soldiers again, not men who learn to fold towels and quote Steinbeck." There was silence. Then Jakob whispered, "Then maybe we teach them." On November 5th, the first truck arrived. A canvas-covered flatbed escorted by 2 military jeeps. The gate creaked open and names were called. Hartman was not among them. Jakob was. So was Mayer, and Koch, and a quiet boy named Paul who had once carved birds from firewood and cried when one of the nurses gave him a harmonica. Each man was issued a new coat, blank paperwork, a stamped document marked Transfer Geneva. Nurse Monroe stood by the gate. Jakob approached her last. She held something out, a small wrapped cloth. He took it, opened it slowly. Inside was the soap chess set, every piece, wrapped in handkerchiefs and bandage gauze. The knight she'd once complimented sat on top. He looked up, throat tight. "Why?" She shrugged. "So you don't forget." He stepped forward, wanted to say more, needed to. But the guard called his name again, louder this time. Jakob turned, walked toward the truck. And when it pulled away, he kept his eyes on her as long as the wire fence allowed. She didn't wave. She just stood there, like a witness. The barracks felt colder that week, fewer men, fewer voices. The chessboard sat in the rec hall, empty now. The piano was covered in a sheet. The nurses carried on with quieter steps. The guards drank coffee more slowly. It was still war outside. Europe was still dying in fire. But inside Camp Ashford, something had ended. Something else had begun. Snow fell early that year. The first flakes dusted Camp Ashford just after Thanksgiving. It caught the men off guard. Many had only just adjusted to the dry heat of Utah. Now, frost curled along the edges of the window panes, and boots slipped on icy gravel in the morning roll call. Inside Barrack 6, Otto Hartman rubbed his hands together beneath the thin Army-issued blanket. The wood stove crackled at the center of the room, but heat didn't reach the far bunks. He lay awake at night, listening to it sputter and hiss, eyes open to the dark, imagining Dresden under snow, imagining his father's workshop, imagining the guilt packed away like a trunk no one dared open. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days. Not since Jakob Weber boarded the repatriation truck. Not since he stood outside the wire, coat buttoned tight, carrying that ridiculous soap chest set like it was a holy relic. Not since he didn't say goodbye. Nurse Abigail Monroe swept the infirmary floor slowly. The radio played low Billie Holiday, her voice barely a breath above the static. The cot that Jakob used to sit on every Wednesday was empty. She hadn't changed the sheet. She told herself it was oversight. A young guard named Fields entered with a clipboard. "New case from Barrack 3, he said, awkward. "Bad cough, might be pneumonia." She nodded. "Bring him in." As the door swung closed, she glanced down at the mop water. A white fragment floated there, soap, a corner, a sliver of a rook. She didn't cry, but the muscles behind her eyes tightened, and the room felt too quiet. That same day, the Geneva transfer list was posted again. New names, more volunteers. Hartman's name wasn't there. Again. He didn't ask why, he already knew. When the camp chaplain offered him a copy of the New Testament in German, he took it without speaking. That night, he tore out the first 10 pages, not out of disrespect, out of desperation. He used the margins to start a letter. "Dear Jakob, I hated you for leaving. I hated the way you carried that notebook like it was proof. I hated how you folded towels like it meant something. I hated how you smiled at her. But mostly, I hate that I can't stop thinking about what you said, that we could teach them. I don't think I know how. But I'm trying." He didn't sign it. He folded it in half and placed it under the chapel door. He never asked if it was mailed. In early December, a new nurse arrived. Her name was Florence Barlow. She had sharp elbows, soft eyes, and a slow Tennessee drawl. She carried a worn satchel stitched with a red cross, and within the first 3 hours of her shift, she had already told 3 guards off for smoking too close to the infirmary. But what startled the prisoners most was how she greeted them. "Darlin'," she called Kunz when he accidentally dropped a bedpan, "would you kindly hand me that mop?" "Sweetheart," she said to Paul when he trembled under a fever and whispered his mother's name, "you're safe now. It's all right to sleep." No one had ever called them those things, not even in Germany. Words like that didn't exist in war. At first they didn't know what to do with them. They flinched. They bristled. One man cursed under his breath. But by the end of her first week, Florence had taught 3 POWs how to knit, convinced another to help her build a second medicine cabinet, and walked a limping man around the perimeter of the yard with his arm over her shoulder like a son learning to walk again. She had not forgiven them. She had simply chosen not to punish them. And that made it worse, because they didn't know how to live with grace. The war outside was ending in fire. In Europe, the Allied push through France had turned into a race toward Berlin. In the Pacific, entire islands were being scorched flat under napalm and steel. The prisoners heard it all secondhand, through leaflets, radio broadcasts, whispers among guards. But what reached them deepest were the letters. Not from family. From the dead. Jakob's letter arrived at Camp Ashford in a Red Cross envelope, sent weeks earlier, handwritten. To whomever still listens. "I wanted to say thank you. You gave me something I didn't have when I arrived, the sound of silence without shame, the ability to sit in a chair without waiting for orders, the sense that a man could be more than what he had done. If you read this, and the war is still on, keep going. If peace has come, don't forget what kindness can do. J.W." It was passed from barrack to barrack, hand to hand, man to man. No one said anything when they read it. But when Hartman reached the end, he folded it once, slid it into the breast pocket of his uniform, and wore it like a medal. On Christmas Eve, the nurses brought cider into the mess hall. Real cider, not the powdered mix, a barrel of it, heated on the stove, sweet with cloves and cinnamon. The prisoners lined up, took mugs in hand, stood without instruction. And then they sang. Not an order, not a performance, just voices thin, worn, some out of tune, lifting still knacked into the rafters. The guards didn't interrupt. They stood with their hats in hand. Some hummed along. Abigail stood by the wall, mug in hand, watching them. Hartman stepped forward. He held something out. A letter, folded, sealed. "It's for Jakob," he said, "if he's still out there." She took it. Then he handed her something else. The chessboard soap pieces, wrapped in cloth, recarved, refined, finished. "I can't take it," he said. She nodded once. "Merry Christmas," she said quietly. He smiled. Not proudly, not fully. But enough. Outside, the snow continued to fall. And behind the wire, the men stood still, voices rising through the night, as if they were trying to sing something clean back into the world. The wire no longer hummed with tension. That was the first thing Nurse Abigail Monroe noticed when she returned from her 3-day leave in January. The wind still scraped across the Utah plains, but the fence, that rusted ribbon of steel that once defined everything, felt quieter. Not relaxed exactly, but worn down. Inside the compound, the men had changed. Not all, not completely, but enough that silence wasn't the same silence anymore. It wasn't fear or calculation. It was reflection. On her first morning back, she found Sergeant Bauman polishing the mess trays. Not as a punishment, not under orders. Just because he said, "I like the shine." Infirmary visits were fewer now, but the conversations were longer. Nurse Lori said they no longer came for medicine. They come to prove they still feel something. Abigail understood. In Barrack 4, Otto Hartman kept to himself more and more. The Christmas letter he'd written to Jakob remained folded in his chest pocket, though it had already been sent. He'd rewritten it 3 times before settling on a version that said almost nothing, just enough to be honest, not enough to be dangerous. He wrote other things now, scraps, sentences, phrases in English. "We have no word for forgiveness. That doesn't also mean forgetting. A hand on your back feels heavier when you deserve the weight. The war took my father's hands. I gave away my name. He didn't show them to anyone. Not yet. But he wrote them, folded them, tucked them into a hollow in the bed frame behind the 3rd slat. A week later, he opened the hiding place and found a piece of paper that wasn't his. 4 words, written in a woman's handwriting. "We haven't forgotten either." He folded that too, carefully. The war in Europe was ending faster than anyone had predicted. January bled into February, and the prisoners heard rumors of the Rhine crossing, cities falling, the Soviets closing in from the east, American forces tightening around the Ruhr. One guard, a young kid from Nebraska, dropped a newspaper on the mess table by accident. The headline showed Berlin in flames. No one picked it up, but everyone read it. That night the compound was quiet, not sullen, just still. Even the piano in the mess hall stayed closed. The keys felt too loud for what the world had become. Hartman began helping Nurse Florence inventory the supply closet. At first he offered out of boredom. She nodded, handed him a clipboard, didn't ask questions. Later, she let him reorganize the storage shelf, then the surgical instruments, then the drawer of stethoscope tubing that no one had ever bothered to untangle. She watched him for days, said nothing, let him work. On the 7th day, she handed him a cup of tea and said, "You fix things like you broke them." He didn't respond. But he didn't leave either. Some men began writing letters to families they hadn't contacted in years. The camp allowed it. Red Cross protocol. 1 page, no politics, no confessions. Just facts. "I am alive. The guards are kind. The food is enough." Sometimes a line slipped in. "They treat us like people. They don't know what we did. They know, and they're kind anyway." In late February, a visitor arrived. Tall civilian coat, clean-shaven, translator's badge clipped to his collar. He spoke with Hartman for nearly an hour inside the chapel. Afterward, Hartman walked back to the barracks and sat alone. Then he took out his old dog tag, ran his thumb over the stamped letters, and snapped the chain. He walked to the infirmary. Abigail was alone, sorting bandages. He placed the tag on the table. "I was a different man when I wore this." She looked at it, said nothing. "I don't want to carry him anymore." "Then don't," she said. He nodded, left. That night, he slept without it under his pillow for the first time since capture. Snow melted slowly that March. The fence posts emerged from drifts like bones rising from earth. The men took longer walks around the yard. Guards stood farther apart. There were no incidents, not anymore. Just cold mornings, quiet chess games, murmured hymns in the mess hall. And the growing sense that soon, the gates would open. Not because they'd broken out. Because someone would let them go. Hartman asked for pen and paper again. He wrote a new letter. Not to Jakob, not to Germany. To the nurses. He didn't sign it. But he folded it neatly and placed it on the infirmary table one morning before anyone arrived. It read, "You didn't have to save us. But you did. Not with medicine. With mercy. We were soldiers. You made us human again. Thank you for the pie." The knock came just before dawn. 3 soft raps on the door to the infirmary, then silence. Abigail Monroe didn't stir from her cot immediately. She waited, listening, not for fear that had passed months ago, but for understanding. The rhythm was different, not urgent, not hesitant, just respectful. She pulled on her coat, buttoned it halfway, and opened the door. Erich Weber stood in the snow with his cap pressed to his chest. His hair had grown long. His posture, once steel-wrapped and rigid, now sagged like a tired bridge. He didn't speak. He simply raised a small tin in both hands. "For the children," he said. Inside the tin were 12 carved toys smoothed by hand, painted with berry dye, finished with wax melted from old candles. Dogs, horses, a strange bird with button eyes, and a woman's figure in a nurse's cap. "For the children," he said again, quieter this time. "Of the town, the orphans." Abigail took the tin with both hands. "We'll make sure they get them." Erich bowed, not sharply but fully, and turned away. She didn't watch him walk back through the snow. She didn't need to. March turned to April. A warm wind arrived early and stayed. The compound thawed like an old wound finally letting go of infection. Mud replaced snow. Grass fought through gravel. The air didn't taste of rust anymore. At dusk, birds began returning. Not all at once, just a few. Swallows, a dove, something bright and yellow none of the men could name. Nurse Lorry started calling roll for them each evening. Stubborn sparrow, confused finch, little lost one. The men laughed, then argued about which bird was which. A lieutenant from Bremen drew them in chalk on the mess hall floor, labeling each in English and German. Swallow Schwalbe. Goldfinch Stieglitz. Dove Taube. A private named Richter corrected his spelling. The others cheered. It became a game. Outside, the barbed wire stood, but the birds never landed on it. Only the fence posts. They knew better. One morning, Nurse Florence found 24 daffodils lying on the infirmary windowsill. No note, no footprints in the dew. The next day, more. Then violets. Then, carefully tied together, a wreath. Inside it, a single red ribbon from an American nurse's uniform, one that had gone missing months earlier. Abigail said nothing, just took the flowers to the chapel and placed them below the simple wooden cross. That night, several guards noticed candles burning quietly in the windows of Barracks 1 and 3. They let them burn. Hartman began organizing English lessons again, but this time the men asked for them. They wanted to know how to say things properly, not just to survive, but to speak, really speak. How do you say? Remorse. Peaceful. Burden. Not yet. He taught them softly. No chalk, no board, just small circles after dinner. Florence joined once, sat in the back, never spoke. But after class she asked, "Do you teach poems too?" Hartman looked up, "Only the ones worth repeating." "Good," she said. "You're ready for mine then." She handed him a page torn from her journal. He read it twice, then folded it, pressed it to his chest. In late April, the announcement came. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. There was no cheer in the compound, no shouting, no celebration. Only silence, heavy, sacred. Men stood still. Some looked west. Others dropped to benches, heads bowed. A few wept openly, not from loss that had come long before, but from finality. They had fought for a cause that no longer existed. They had served an army that had dissolved in the fire of its own making. They had worn symbols now banned by the world. And still, the nurses treated them like men. That evening, the mess hall served stew and bread and a small slice of apple pie, not because of victory or defeat, but because it was Sunday. And Sundays, said Nurse Lowry, deserved sweetness. That night the guards opened the gates. Not to release them, just to let them walk. A chaperoned stroll beyond the compound's edge, to the small stream running behind the camp. 1 hour, no weapons, no tension. And still not a single man ran. They walked slowly, deliberately. Some stopped to kneel at the stream, others cupped water in their hands. One man, a former tank commander, broke away briefly, not to escape, but to kneel in the dirt and kiss the earth. A bird landed on his shoulder. He didn't move. 2 days later, a boy from the local town came through the gate. He couldn't have been more than 6, shoes too big, shirt too small. He carried a wooden plane broken in two. He stood by the wire and just waited. Weber saw him first, walked over. The boy held up the pieces. Weber knelt, took them gently, and nodded. He spent the next 2 hours fixing it, carving a new propeller from an old crate, sanding the wing edge with a scrap of burlap, balancing it with a small pebble in the fuselage. When he handed it back, the boy didn't say a word. He just smiled and ran. Later that week, a transport truck arrived. 8 names were called. Repatriation, Geneva Protocol. The men packed quietly. No speeches, no salutes, just handshakes, brief embraces, eyes that lingered too long. When Hartman's name wasn't called, he didn't react. But Florence saw his hand tremble slightly as he returned to sweeping the infirmary. She placed a note under his mug that night. Not yet is not never. As the sun set on the last day of April, a nurse and a prisoner sat side by side on the steps of the chapel. No guards watched them. They talked of books, music, a lake in Bavaria neither had seen. Then, without warning, he said, "I was there in Poland, not at the worst of it, but I heard, I knew." The nurse didn't flinch. She waited. He spoke again. "My silence was not innocence." She nodded. "Neither is mine," she said. "I treat men who once would have killed my brothers, and I offer kindness anyway." The wind moved softly around them. He looked up at the wire. "It never kept you out," he said. "No," she answered. "It kept you in until you were ready." Summer came early to the camp. Not the brutal heat of the American South, but something gentler. A stretch of golden weeks when the mornings stayed cool, the afternoons shimmered just enough to coax life from the garden beds, and the evenings invited songs sung quietly through open windows. The fences were still there, the rules unchanged, but the rhythm had shifted. It wasn't mercy that softened the place. It was memory. and how each soul inside those walls carried it differently. One morning, Abigail Monroe stood before the mirror in the nurse's dormitory, brushing out her hair with slow, methodical strokes. She had done this 1,000 times. But now, for the first time in months, she noticed the streak of gray that ran just behind her ear. Not age, not worry. It was something else. The accumulation of stories, buried deep, of bandaged hands and fever dreams, of toothache soothed by soup, of letters dictated by candlelight to mothers who would never respond, of one man who couldn't stop humming Brahms when the morphine took hold, of another who asked to see the stars through clean glass before he died, of those who hadn't cried until they saw her smile, and those who never cried at all. By June, a list began circulating. Voluntary departures, transfers for repatriation. Each name read aloud at morning roll, calls struck the camp like a drumbeat. Some smiled, others clenched their jaws. Hartman simply folded his hands behind his back and looked west. Erich Weber's name was fourth on the list. He didn't sleep the night before. When the truck arrived, the compound gathered silently, not by order, just instinct. The nurses stood near the chapel steps, the men by the barracks. A few guards leaned against the posts, arms crossed but eyes watching. Weber carried no suitcase, just a small bundle of papers, poems, sketches, folded letters. Before he climbed aboard, he turned to the nurses. His gaze paused on Florence, then Abigail. He stepped forward slowly, not to speak, but to kneel. And with practiced, trembling hands, he removed his cap, placed it gently on the dirt, and pressed his forehead to the earth. No one moved. No one dared. The summer deepened. Dust replaced mud. The birds nested low to avoid the heat. Infirmary duties shrank as the men's health stabilized. Instead, the nurses took up odd tasks, cataloging books, teaching fractions, organizing Sunday walks beyond the fence line under escort. Once, Abigail joined a game of chess in the shade of the laundry tent. She lost in 17 moves to a boy who'd barely spoken since arrival. He smiled shyly afterward. "I used to play with my father," he said. "And who won?" she asked. He paused. "We never finished." A surprise came in August, a shipment from a Lutheran relief agency. Inside were books, blankets, tins of coffee, and something unexpected, musical instruments. An old upright piano, 2 battered violins, a harmonica, and a clarinet missing a reed. The guards looked at the delivery with skepticism. But Nurse Lori grinned. "Music," she said, "is cheaper than morphine." And so the evenings changed again. The mess hall became a concert space. The first time the piano sounded, its keys unsure, its chords hesitant, every man stopped eating mid-bite. By the third song, they were clapping. By the fifth, they were singing. By the seventh, someone cried. Letters began arriving from families in Germany, not many and not quickly, but enough. A mother's shaky script, a child's drawing of a stick figure in a soldier's cap, a letter from a wife that began with one word. "Alive." Hartman read it aloud to the men in barracks too. At the end he said only, "Yes, I will write back." And he did, on thin paper with ink that bled at the edges. He read her reply a week later under the cottonwood tree. It said, "We planted beets. I told the children you'd be home before the first frost. Please make me write." One evening, Abigail found herself on the infirmary steps long after the others had gone to bed. A figure approached, cautious but unafraid. It was Richter, the youngest of the POWs. He couldn't have been more than 18, though the war had aged his eyes beyond reckoning. He stood there, clutching something wrapped in brown paper. "I carved it for you," he said, and offered the bundle. Inside was a wooden sculpture, crude, rough, but unmistakable. a woman in a nurse's dress standing tall with open arms. "I didn't know how to make a face," he said quickly, nervous, "so I left it blank, but it's supposed to be you." She touched the figure gently. "It's beautiful." He nodded once, then turned to go, but paused. "Thank you," he said, for giving us back pieces of who we were." The camp's final month was quiet. No announcements, no big changes. Just an unspoken understanding that this place, once full of suspicion and silence, had become something else entirely. Not a home. Not exactly. But a place where some of the pieces had started to mend, and where the distance between former enemies had narrowed to something very small. On the last morning of the nurses' rotation, the sun rose late. Abigail packed her bag slowly. Florence folded her uniform with careful hands. Lori stood by the door, arms crossed, trying not to cry. Outside, the compound lined up without orders. Not for inspection, but to say goodbye. Erich Weber was gone, so were dozens of others. But Hartman remained, Richter too, and hundreds more who had survived their war not through surrender, but through kindness. And so, as the nurses walked to the gates, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the men began to sing. Softly at first, a hymn they had heard the women humming in the infirmary, now learned by memory and sung with reverence. It was not German. It was not English. It was something beyond language. A melody of grace. Abigail stopped at the threshold, looked back. Then slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward and opened the gate herself. They didn't follow, they never tried to. But they watched her go until the dust swallowed her boots, the sun caught her shoulders, and the war finally stayed behind the wire.